Just as important, maybe more importantly, the regime was internally cohesive and surprisingly resilient. There have been defections from the regime, and we may be getting more defections in the past few days and so on. Basically, the core of the regime is held together. It's kind of a hang together or hang separately situation so far. Core, I think, is hanging together fairly well. And its forces, very importantly, its forces also have shown lots of cohesion and willingness to stay in the fight. I make it right now that they've been fighting for 91 days as of today. Okay, that's not a trivial statistic, and they've been under air attack for 62 days. Okay, and that's not a trivial data point either. That's a long time for them to be in this fight and to still be fighting, coherently and so on. We are now beginning to see, I think, some indications of loss of cohesion in units, especially around the Misrata front, but no widespread breakdown so far in the cohesion of the Libyan military. Another reason they're still standing is that they've proven to be very adaptive to the type of conflict they're in. And again, I think this is somewhat surprising. At all stages of the war, they've been able to adjust to the type of fighting that they were involved in, to develop tactics and techniques for dealing with the situation, and especially I think in accommodating loss of total control of the air and being totally vulnerable to NATO air attack. But they found ways, at the tactical level and operational level, to get around that. An example of this is the kind of shoot and scoot tactics they use with their artillery and multiple rocket launchers. Well, they'll just pop out of cover, fire, and then pop back into cover, hoping to avoid being struck by NATO air. Nevertheless, there are limits to how much you can adapt to that type of situation, and I think they're approaching the limits of that. In a related way, they've also been very skillful, energetic, and creative in their solutions for the situation and how they use their resources. They've developed these effective raiding tactics for operating in the desert, which has reduced their exposure to NATO air power and allowed them to continue to attack rebel strongholds. They were able to develop the means to ambush rebel forces, to scatter them with mortar and artillery fire after they lost control of the air. And their siege and raiding tactics have been effective, or somewhat effective, against rebel-held areas and cities. On the downside for this regime, I think, is from the beginning they had a strategy of trying to hold on to everything. The regime has never ceded any area of Libya to the rebels. From the beginning, they fought to retain Benghazi in the east. They've continued to try and operate in that area and conduct operations in the area. And I think that's effectively prevented the regime from concentrating enough forces in any one area to win clear victories over the rebels. And I think this is coming home to haunt them. So how do you explain rebel successes and failures in the war? Okay. Well, rebel performance, has been mixed. They've done some things well, some things badly over time. You have to look, though, at the starting point for the rebels, which is virtually nothing in terms of organized military forces. They are getting better now, and they're getting more organized. They're improving, I think, their combat capabilities, but they started pretty much at zero relative to the regime, and so they did have some successes and some failures. The early successes were they defeated Qaddhafi forces, virtually completely in the east in the initial surge. Even though the regime tried to fight back there, they lost. And in Misrata and in the Fusa Mountains in the west, they were able to rebel and hold on to those territories virtually from the beginning of the conflict. They held Aujali, even though the regime said they took it. It looks to me like they never took it completely. The defense of Misrata is probably the key battle of the war so far. We may come to see that eventually as kind of the graveyard of the regime. The fact that the regime committed maybe 10,000 of its troops there, it was unable to take the city. And as I said, the defense of the Nafusa Mountains is very great success for the rebels. And it also it demonstrates both that and the fighting in the Misrata in particular demonstrated the ability of the rebels for self-organizing resistance. They were able to pull this together basically on their own resources and to mount very effective defenses in those areas. Now, the rebels have failed in a few areas. They failed to conduct these major offensives early on in the war where they were pressing towards Sirte and were never able to take it. And they basically haven't shown the ability yet to take and hold ground. They're taking ground now around Misrata, pushing out of the city. Remains to be seen if they can hold on to that. And in areas where the regime was able to successfully isolate a city and concentrate enough forces, they were able to take those areas. There's several critical processes at work, I think, in the war, and they're important to understanding how the war is going. One of these is the simple process of attrition. Both sides are suffering attrition in terms of manpower, personnel, and in terms of equipment. I think because of NATO's intervention now, this process is now working basically more against the regime than it is against the rebels. The rebels, their heavy equipment, you can see it on the videos they post on the various websites. They're well worth looking at. You can see basically what they got is kind of hillbilly armor, hillbilly weapon systems, right? They're trucks with heavy anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on them and so on. They're losing some of those. What the regime is losing is tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, multiple rocket launchers, and self-propelled artillery systems. Its most important weapon systems. Both sides are losing personnel, as I said, but the regime is losing skilled military personnel, tank crews, artillery crews, and so on. The rebels are losing the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers. Civilians that have joined up, given some military training, and committed to battle. Those guys are easy to replace. So I think the attrition is basically working, I think, in favor of the rebels, although it's a slow process. Attrition also is not just a matter of NATO action. The rebels are inflicting, I think, significant attrition on the regime forces in the ground combat that they're involved in. Second process, and I've already alluded to it, is this ability to adapt to the nature of the war. And both sides are showing that they can adapt effectively to the type of combat that we're involved in. But it looks to me like the rebels got an advantage here because I think the regime is approaching the limits of its ability to adapt at the tactical and operational levels. There's not much more, I think, that they can do to adjust to the type of warfare. So I think this process is also going to favor the rebels. And also, I think the element of cohesion here is working in favor of the rebels. We have limited evidence, as I said, that the regime forces are starting to fray somewhat. Once cohesion starts to go in military forces, it tends to accelerate rather than slow down or stop. And the rebels look very cohesive. All the reporting we see on them indicates very high levels of morale, strong cohesion, willingness to fight, willingness to continue to battle. They've also been fighting for 91 days and so on. So I think all three of those processes basically are working in favor of the rebels, although not rapidly. And of course, the speed of all this is an issue in the war.